This billionaire let his only grandson rot in the slums for 8 years. But what he did the moment the boy arrived will make your blood boil. He didn't just kick the mother out. He forced an 8-year-old to sign a loyalty contract so cruel it's currently being banned across the continent. If you think wealth justifies this level of evil, keep scrolling. But if you want to see the moment this lion finally got humbled, you need to hear this. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The humidity of Lagos in early December was a physical weight, a thick blanket of salt spray and diesel fumes that clung to the vibrant, chaotic streets of Meta. Toby sat on a low wooden stool outside his mother's small tailoring shop, his eyes bright with a curiosity that seemed too large for his 8-year-old frame. He watched the world go by, the frantic movement of the yellow Danfo buses, the hawkers balancing trays of plantain chips with impossible grace, and the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of his mother's manual singer, sewing machine inside. To Toby, this wasn't a place of poverty. It was a theater of wonders where every person had a song and every corner held a story. He spent his afternoons helping the elderly Madame Kofo carry her groceries or sharing his meager lunch with the stray dogs that patrolled the gutters. There was a natural, unforced nobility in the way he moved, a kindness that made the gruffest bus drivers soften their voices when they spoke to him. He didn't know yet that the small gold locket he wore around his neck, containing a faded photo of a man in a pilot's uniform, was a key to a world of cold marble and silent corridors that would soon attempt to swallow his light. His mother, Sarah, watched him from the shadows of the shop, her heart a complex tapestry of pride and lingering sorrow. She saw so much of Adewale in the boy, the same stubborn tilt of the chin, the same way his laughter seemed to bubble up from the very soles of his feet. They lived on the edge of a knife, financially speaking, but Sarah had shielded him from the sharpest blades of their reality, feeding his soul with stories of a father who was a hero, a man who chose love over an empire. Adewale had been the golden son of the Othniel dynasty, a prince of the East who had walked away from a billion-dollar inheritance to marry a woman who sewed clothes for the working class. Sarah knew that the world they occupied was a temporary sanctuary, a bubble of peace in a city that took more than it gave. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the smoggy sky in hues of bruised purple and burnt orange, a sleek, black Mercedes-Benz, a car that looked like a shark in a pond of minnows, turned into their narrow street. The silence that followed the car's arrival was heavy, pregnant with the realization that the past Sarah had fled was finally knocking on her door, ready to reclaim the only thing she had left. The car did not belong in Meta. It was a polished intruder, its obsidian paint reflecting the peeling posters and the dusty storefronts like a mocking mirror. When the engine cut out, the silence that rushed back into the street felt different, colder, despite the lingering Lagos heat. A man stepped out, dressed in a suit that cost more than the entire block's annual rent, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the uneven pavement as he approached the tailoring shop. Toby stood up, his small hands dusting off his shorts, looking at the stranger not with fear, but with the open-hearted interest of a host. The man, a lawyer named Mr. Soyinka, who had served the Othniel family for decades, paused when his eyes met Toby's. He saw the lion in the boy's gaze, the same piercing intensity he had seen in the old chief, but filtered through a lens of inexplicable sweetness. It was a haunting sight, a reminder of the Adewale he had once known, the prince who had traded his crown for a life of meaning. Inside the shop, Sarah stood frozen, her hands still resting on the flywheel of her sewing machine. She didn't need to be told why he was there. The news of the plane crash that had claimed the chief's other 2 sons had reached even the humblest radio in the market. The Othniel line, once a thick forest of heirs, had been pruned by tragedy until only this small boy remained. Mr. Soyinka spoke with a voice that was practiced and professional, yet wavered slightly as he delivered the summons from the east. The Lion of the Valley was dying not of a malady of the flesh, but of a vacuum in his legacy, and he wanted his grandson. He wanted the boy he had spent 8 years pretending didn't exist. The offer was framed as a demand, a chance for Toby to take his rightful place as the heir to a kingdom of industry, land, and power. Sarah looked at Toby, who was now standing by the door, watching a moth flutter against the light bulb. She saw the innocence she had fought so hard to protect, and she realized with a crushing ache that to save her son's future, she might have to lose him to the very man who had broken her husband's heart. The night before their departure, the air in their small room was thick with the scent of lavender starch and the low hum of a distant generator. Sarah sat Toby down on the edge of their shared bed, the worn African print coverlet a stark contrast to the gravity in her eyes. She held his small hands, hers calloused from years of needlework, but steady as a rock. She began to tell him the story not of a pilot, but of a prince who chose a different kind of kingdom. She explained that his grandfather, Chief Othniel, was a man who measured the world in hectares and stock prices, a man who believed that vulnerability was a flaw in the diamond of his legacy. His father, Adewale, had been the only one brave enough to tell the lion that a crown is heavy if it isn't lined with compassion. She spoke of the bitter rift, how the chief had demanded Adewale abandon Sarah to marry into a political dynasty, and how his father had instead walked out into the Lagos rain with nothing but a flight bag and a heart full of hope. Toby listened, his young mind trying to reconcile the image of a grandfather he had never met with the warmth of the father he only knew through whispers and fading photographs. The Othniel name, she warned him, was a heavy garment. It would give him power, but it would also try to change the shape of his soul. Toby looked at the small locket around his neck, the metal warm against his skin, and asked if his grandfather was a bad man. Sarah paused, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows against the cracked plaster walls. She told him that people are rarely just bad, but that some people get lost in their own shadows, building walls so high they forget what the sun looks like. She told him that he was being sent to Enugu not just as an heir, but as a bridge. She described the lion's loneliness, the way the chief had lost his other sons to the very world of excess he had built for them. Sarah's voice was a soft melody of warning and love, urging Toby to remember the kindness of the street vendors, the shared laughter of the Lagos markets, and the way they had always found enough to share even when the pot was nearly empty. She made him promise that no matter how much gold they placed on his shoulders, he would never stop looking at people with his heart instead of his eyes. As Toby finally drifted into a restless sleep, Sarah stayed awake, watching the moonlight filter through the burglar bars, wondering if she was throwing her lamb into a den from which he would never return unchanged. The morning of their departure was a blur of vibrant chaos and sharp, sudden silences. The neighborhood of Abute Meta seemed to sense that its favorite son was leaving. The mama put across the street packed a final bag of spicy puff-puff for Toby, and even the local area boys, usually hardened by the city's grit, offered a respectful nod as the black Mercedes returned to claim the boy. Sarah moved with a quiet, regal dignity, packing their lives into 2 modest suitcases, refusing the lawyer's offer to buy them an entirely new wardrobe before they arrived. She wanted Toby to remember the texture of their struggle, the weight of the cotton they had sewn together. As they drove away, Toby pressed his face against the cool glass of the window, watching the familiar landscape of Lagos dissolve, the sprawling Third Mainland Bridge, the still houses of Makoko rising like ghosts from the dark water, and the endless sea of yellow buses. He felt a strange pang of sapele in his chest, a longing for a home he was leaving behind, even as he moved toward a destiny he didn't fully understand. The transition from a humid, salt-thick air of the coast to the climate-controlled silence of the car felt like the first step into a different dimension, one where the noise of humanity was replaced by the hum of expensive machinery. They arrived at the private terminal, a place of glass and polished chrome that felt light years away from the dusty streets they had occupied just hours before. A small, sleek jet waited on the tarmac, the Othniel family crest, a roaring lion, embossed in gold on its tail. Toby gripped his mother's hand tightly as they ascended the stairs, his eyes wide at the luxury inside, the cream-colored leather seats, the mahogany tables, and the silent attendants who treated him with a terrifying level of deference. As the plane soared over the patchwork quilt of the Nigerian landscape, leaving the smog of Lagos for the lush, rolling green of the east, Toby felt the world shrinking beneath him. He watched the clouds, imagining his father flying among them, and wondered if the Lion of the Valley was watching the sky, waiting for the arrival of the grandson he had discarded years ago. Sarah sat across from him, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her face a mask of iron resolve. She knew that once they touched down in Enugu, the battle for Toby's identity would truly begin, and she prepared herself to be the anchor in the storm of wealth and resentment that awaited them in the hills of the ancestral estate. As the car wound its way up the undulating hills of Enugu, the air turned crisp and carried the sharp, dry scent of the harmattan, a northern wind that brought with it the fine red dust of the Sahara. The landscape here was a dramatic departure from the flat, watery sprawl of Lagos. Ancient, majestic trees stood like sentinels over valleys that glowed with a deep, earthy orange in the afternoon sun. Then, rising from the crest of the highest hill, Toby saw it, the Othniel estate. It was less a house and more a fortress of modern African architecture, a sprawling complex of white stone, expansive glass, and tiered gardens that seemed to defy the rugged terrain. Tall, iron gates swung open with a silent, mechanical grace, revealing a driveway lined with flame trees that shed brilliant red petals like a royal carpet. To an 8-year-old boy who had grown up in a 2-room apartment, the castle was breathtaking and intimidating, a monument to a man's power over the land. Yet, despite the splendor, there was an eerie stillness to the place, a lack of the vibrant noise and communal laughter that Toby associated with home. It was a palace built of silence and shadows. They were greeted at the grand entrance by a phalanx of staff, all dressed in crisp uniforms, their heads bowed in a way that made Toby feel profoundly uncomfortable. He looked for a friendly face, a spark of the Lagos energy, but found only practiced professionalism. The interior of the house was a cathedral of wealth. High ceilings with chandeliers that looked like frozen rain, floors of polished marble that echoed every footfall, and walls adorned with art that depicted the Othniel lineage in stern, uncompromising poses. Toby's small sneakers squeaked against the stone as he walked, a tiny figure in an ocean of opulence. He noticed that the air inside was cold, chilled by a massive central cooling system that seemed designed to keep the world at a distance. Sarah walked beside him, her presence the only thing keeping the vastness of the space from swallowing him whole. She could feel the eyes of the portraits watching them, the ancestors of the man who had disowned her husband, and she felt the weight of the red dust outside settling on her heart. This was the kingdom Toby was meant to inherit. But as he looked at the cold, beautiful expanse, he felt a sudden, sharp longing for the messy, warm embrace of a life they had left behind. The meeting with the chief took place in the great library, a room that smelled of old leather, expensive tobacco, and the crushing weight of history. Chief Othniel sat in a massive wingback chair, his figure framed by a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the valley he essentially owned. He was a man carved from mahogany, tall, even in his seated position, with hair as white as the harmattan haze and eyes that cut through the room like a hawk's. He didn't rise when they entered. He simply watched, his gaze fixed on Toby with an intensity that would have made a grown man tremble. He was looking for his son Adewale in the boy's features, searching for a sign of the rebellion that had cost him his favorite heir. What he found instead was a child who walked toward him with a strange, quiet confidence, not cowed by the gold-embossed books or the sheer scale of the room. Toby stopped a few feet from the chair and offered a respectful bow, a gesture he had learned in the neighborhood, and said, "Good afternoon, grandfather. My mother says you have been very lonely, so I have come to keep you company." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as if the very air had solidified. The chief's grip tightened on the silver head of his walking stick, his knuckles turning a pale gray. No one had spoken to him of loneliness in decades. People spoke to him of mergers, of political leverage, and of the fear he inspired. He looked past Toby to Sarah, who stood by the door, her face a mask of calm defiance. In that moment, the chief realized that his plan to mold the boy would be a war of wills, not just a transfer of property. He grunted, a sound like grinding stones, and told Toby that he was here to learn how to be a lord of the valley, not to offer platitudes. But as Toby smiled, a bright, genuine expression that seemed to illuminate the dim corners of the library, the chief felt a strange, uncomfortable flutter in his chest. It was the first crack in an armor that had been forged over 70 years of ruthless ambition. He dismissed them with a sharp wave of his hand, but his eyes followed Toby until the heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving the old man alone with the echo of a word he hadn't let himself think about in a very long time. Grandfather. The first blow to Toby's new life came that evening, delivered by Mr. Soyinka with the clinical detachment of a man reading a contract. The chief had decreed that while Toby would reside in the main house to undergo his instruction, Sarah was to be housed in the guest lodge, a beautiful building, to be sure, but one located at the far edge of the estate's manicured grounds. The implication was clear. The chief viewed Sarah as a contaminant, a reminder of the lower life that had stolen his son. Toby's reaction was not the temper tantrum of spoiled heir, but a quiet, devastating sadness. He looked from a lawyer to his mother, his eyes brimming with a confusion that hurt more than anger. Sarah, sensing the chief's move to isolate and weaken her influence, knelt down to Toby's level. She told him that she would be just a short walk away, and that they would spend every afternoon together, but Toby's heart wasn't fooled. He understood that in this castle, love was a commodity that the chief intended to ration. That night, Toby lay in a bed that was large enough for 4 people, tucked under silk sheets that felt strangely cold against his skin. The room was filled with expensive toys, hand-carved wooden animals, silver trains, and books bound in leather, but he didn't touch any of them. He missed the sound of his mother's sewing machine, the comforting rhythm that had been the heartbeat of his childhood. He crept to the window and looked out toward the distant lights of the guest lodge, a small spark in the darkness of the valley. He realized then that being a little lord was a lonely business, a role that required him to trade his warmth for a title. But Toby was his father's son, and as the wind howled through the eaves of the great house, he made a silent vow. If his grandfather wanted him to be the master of this house, he would do it on his own terms. He wouldn't let the chief's walls stay standing. He would be the boy who brought the light of the guest lodge into the cold marble halls of the main house, even if it meant defying the lion himself. The following days were an exercise in structured isolation. Toby was assigned tutors who spoke in clipped tones about economics, geography, and the Othniel legacy, attempting to fill his head with the mechanics of power. They found him a difficult student, not because he was slow. On the contrary, his mind was as sharp as a tailor's needle, but because he constantly redirected the lessons toward the human element. When they taught him about the estate's palm oil plantations, he asked about the families who worked the land and where their children went to school. When they showed him the family's vast real estate holdings in Enugu City, he inquired about why there were people sleeping under the bridges he saw in the photographs. He wandered the marble halls like a small, inquisitive ghost, his presence a constant disruption to the silent, clockwork efficiency of the household. He made it a point to learn the names of every servant, from the head chef to the youngest gardener, treating them with a level of respect that clearly unnerved them, as they were used to being invisible. The chief watched these developments through a sophisticated network of security cameras and the reports of his staff. He was frustrated by the boy's refusal to harden, yet he found himself increasingly drawn to the child's company. He began to invite Toby to join him for dinner, a formal affair in a dining room that could seat 50. The two sat at opposite ends of a long mahogany table, the space between them filled with silver candelabras and the weight of unspoken history. Toby would talk about his mother's wisdom or the stories his father had told him about the spirit of the valley, unaware that he was poking at the chief's most sensitive wounds. The old man tried to counter with stories of his own triumphs, of businesses bought and rivals crushed, but Toby would simply listen and then ask, "But grandfather, were they happy?" It was a question the chief had no answer for. One evening, after Toby had finished a particularly vivid description of a Lagos street festival, the chief found himself smiling, a genuine, rusty movement of the facial muscles that he quickly suppressed. The boy was a virus of joy, and the chief's defenses were beginning to crumble, one dinner at a time. One afternoon, driven by a curiosity that the estate's walls could not contain, Toby slipped past the security detail during their shift change. He followed a red dirt path that snaked away from the manicured lawns and toward the village of Dust, the settlement where the estate's tenants lived. As he descended the hill, the splendor of the Othniel mansion faded, replaced by the reality of life for those who built his grandfather's wealth. He saw houses made of sun-dried mud with rusted corrugated iron roofs that rattled in the harmattan wind. He saw children his own age carrying heavy plastic jerrycans of water from a muddy stream because the estate's pipes didn't extend to the village. The contrast was a physical blow to his chest. It was Lagos poverty, but without the Lagos vibrancy. Here, the people looked tired, their eyes clouded with the same red dust that coated everything they owned. They looked at Toby's expensive clothes, his tailored shorts and polished shoes, with a mixture of awe and a deep, simmering resentment that he was too young to fully name, but old enough to feel. He met a boy named Chitty, who was trying to fix a leaking roof with scraps of plastic and old tires. Toby didn't stand apart. He sat in the dust and helped Chitty hold the plastic in place, his hands quickly becoming stained with the red earth of Enugu. As they worked, Chitty told him about the big man on the hill, a man who raised their rent whenever the harvest was good and ignored them when the rains failed. He spoke of a clinic with no medicine and a school with no desks. Toby listened, his heart breaking with every word. He realized that the splendor he lived in was paid for by the struggle of the people in the valley. When he finally returned to the mansion, his clothes ruined and his face streaked with dirt, the chief was waiting for him, furious. But Toby didn't apologize. He looked at his grandfather with a clarity that was terrifying in a child and said, "Your house is very beautiful, grandfather, but the people who live down there are crying. Did you forget to listen?" The lion roared in anger, but for the first time, the roar sounded like a defense, a desperate attempt to drown out a truth he could no longer ignore. Determined to find a way to reach the man his grandfather used to be, Toby began searching the house for traces of his father. He eventually found a locked door in the west wing, a part of the house the chief had ordered sealed years ago. Using a key he had borrowed from the housekeeper's ring, Toby stepped into a room frozen in time. It was his father's bedroom, exactly as he had left it the day he walked away. There were model airplanes on the shelves, posters of jazz musicians on the walls, and a thick, leather-bound journal on the nightstand. Toby sat on the bed, the same bed his father had slept in as a boy, and began to read. The journal wasn't just a diary. It was a blueprint. Adewale had written extensively about his dreams for the valley, plans for a solar-powered irrigation system, a modern hospital, and a vocational school that would teach the villagers the skills they needed to be independent. He had written about how much he loved his father, but how he couldn't be a part of a legacy that built its throne on the backs of the broken. Toby spent hours in that room, feeling his father's presence in every object. He realized that the nobility his father had shown wasn't just about kindness. It was about responsibility. He found a photograph tucked into the back of the journal, a picture of a young, smiling Chief Othniel holding a toddler Adewale on his shoulders. The man in the photo didn't look like a lion. He looked like a father who was proud and full of light. Toby realized that the grief of losing his sons hadn't just made the chief angry. It had made him a prisoner of his own regret. He took the journal with him when he left the room, clutching it to his chest like a holy relic. He knew now what he had to do. He wouldn't just be the heir to the money. He would be the heir to the dream. He would use the Othniel name to finish what his father had started, even if he had to drag his grandfather, kicking and screaming, into the light. The ghost of Adewale was no longer just a memory in a locket. It was a fire in Toby's blood. The opportunity for Toby's first intervention came a few days later, during a particularly harsh harmattan morning when the dust was so thick it obscured the sun. The chief was in a foul mood, dealing with a report about a dip in the plantation's productivity. Toby entered the library, carrying his father's journal, and waited for the old man to stop shouting at a terrified manager. When the room was finally quiet, Toby approached and laid the journal on the chief's desk, open to a page where Adewale had sketched a plan for a community well. "Chitty's family has no water, grandfather," Toby said softly. "They have to walk 2 miles to the stream, and the water makes the babies sick. My father said that a great man is like a tree. He provides shade for everyone, not just for himself. If you fix the well, the people will be stronger, and they will work better. Isn't that good for business?" He used the chief's own language of business and logic, but the underlying plea was pure, unadulterated love. The chief looked at the handwriting, the familiar, elegant script of the son he had loved and lost, and his hand trembled. He looked at the sketch, a dream he had mocked and dismissed years ago, and then he looked at Toby. The boy didn't look like a rebel. He looked like a mirror, reflecting back a version of the chief that had long since died. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock. Finally, the chief cleared his throat and called for Mr. Soyinka. "The well in the lower village," he said, his voice unusually gravelly. "Send the engineering team today, and tell them to check the roofs of the surrounding houses. We can't have our tenants getting sick during the dust season. It's inefficient." It was a small victory, couched in the language of cold pragmatism, but Toby saw the way the chief's eyes lingered on the journal. The thaw had begun. The lion hadn't changed his nature yet, but he had allowed a single ray of sunlight to penetrate the permafrost of his heart. As the well project began, bringing a surge of hope to the village, a different kind of shadow began to fall over the estate. The harmattan chill was particularly brutal this year, and Toby, whose body was used to the humid warmth of the coast, began to struggle. He developed a persistent, hollow cough that seemed to vibrate through his small frame, and his usual boundless energy began to flag. Sarah, watching him during their afternoon visits, grew increasingly worried. She saw the way his skin seemed to pale and how he would become breathless after even a short walk through the gardens. She knew something that the chief did not, that Toby had been born with a slight abnormality in his heart, a fragile valve that the doctors in Lagos had said he would likely outgrow, but which required him to avoid extreme stress and harsh environments. The red dust of Enugu and the emotional weight of his new role were taking a toll on a heart that was already overburdened by the world's sorrows. One afternoon, while trying to show the chief the progress on the well from the balcony, Toby suddenly swayed and collapsed. The chief, who had been laughing at one of Toby's jokes, moved with a speed that defied his age, catching the boy before he hit the marble floor. The panic that seized the old man was absolute, a visceral, primitive fear that he was about to lose the only thing that had made him feel alive in a decade. He roared for the household doctors, his voice echoing through the mansion like a wounded beast. Sarah arrived minutes later, her face a mask of terror, and for the first time, she and the chief stood on the same side of a tragedy. The doctor's diagnosis was sobering. The boy's heart was struggling under the strain of severe respiratory infection brought on by the dust and the cold. He needed rest, specialized care, and above all, peace. The chief, looking at the small, pale figure in the massive bed, felt a crushing sense of guilt. He had brought the boy here to save his legacy, but he realized with a sickening clarity that in doing so, he might have broken the very thing he sought to preserve. While Toby was confined to his bed, a crisis erupted in the village that threatened to undo all the progress that had been made. A mid-level manager, seeking to impress the chief with cost-cutting measures, while the old man was distracted by Toby's illness, had issued eviction notices to several families whose homes were slated for a plantation expansion. Among them was Chitty's family. The news reached the mansion through the frantic whispers of the staff, eventually making its way to Toby's bedside. Despite his weakness, the news acted like a lightning strike. Toby refused to eat, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He sent a message to his grandfather, demanding to see him. When the chief entered the room, expecting to comfort a sick child, he was met instead by a little lord who looked every bit the descendant of a line of warriors. Toby spoke with a voice that was thin but steady, accusing the chief of being a king of ashes if he allowed his people to be thrown into the cold during the Christmas season. "How can we celebrate Christmas in this big house?" Toby asked, his breath hitching, "when the people who built it have nowhere to sleep? My father said that a home isn't just a building, it's a promise. Are you a man who breaks his promises, grandfather?" The chief tried to argue that it was a business decision he hadn't personally authorized, but Toby wouldn't hear it. He told the chief that as the heir to the Othniel name, he officially vetoed the expansion. The audacity of the statement, a sick 8-year-old child claiming authority over a multi-billion naira empire, would have been laughable if it wasn't so profoundly serious. The chief looked at Toby, then at Sarah, who was standing in the corner, her silent strength a testament to the boy's upbringing. He realized that Toby wasn't just his grandson, he was his conscience. That evening, the eviction notices were publicly rescinded, and the manager responsible was dismissed. But the victory was bittersweet. As the village celebrated, Toby's condition took a turn for the worse, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird against the bars of his ribs. The days leading up to Christmas were a tense vigil. Toby's room became the nerve center of the estate, a place where the barriers of class and history began to blur. The chief, unable to stay away, spent hours sitting by Toby's bed, listening as the boy, in his clearer moments, dictated policies of kindness. Toby had the chief bring in the village elders, and he watched from his pillows as his grandfather, a man who had never apologized to anyone, sat and listened to their grievances about the school and the clinic. Toby acted as a mediator, translating the elders' humble requests into strategic investments that the chief could accept. It was a bizarre and beautiful sight, a billionaire and a group of impoverished farmers, brokering a new future over the bed of a sick child. Toby's influence was like a gentle rain on parched earth. The more he gave of himself, the more the chief's hardened heart seemed to soften, though the effort was clearly draining the boy's meager reserves of strength. During one of these sessions, Toby reached out and took his grandfather's hand, placing it on top of his father's journal. "You don't have to be the lion anymore, grandfather," he whispered. "You could just be a man who is loved. The people are not your tenants, they are your family. That's what Dad wanted you to know." The chief, a man who had built his life on the idea that love was a weakness, found himself weeping quiet, dignified tears that washed away years of bitterness. He realized that for 70 years he had been building a monument to himself, but Toby was building a legacy of people. He promised Toby that the Christmas gala, usually a superficial gathering of the country's elite, would be different this year. It wouldn't be a display of wealth. It would be a celebration of the valley. But as the chief made these promises, he felt a cold dread. Toby's hands were growing colder, and the doctors' faces were becoming increasingly grim. The heartbreaking Christmas he had feared was looming, and the lion realized that all his billions couldn't buy a single extra beat for the heart of the boy who had saved him. In the quiet hours of Christmas Eve, when a mansion was draped in silk and the scent of roasting meat began to waft from the kitchens, Sarah and the chief found themselves alone in the great hall. The tension that had existed between them since Toby's arrival had transformed into a shared, heavy grief. They stood before a small altar Toby had insisted on, a table covered in photos of Adewale, surrounded by candles and the red flowers of the Enugu hills. The chief turned to Sarah and, for the first time, spoke to her not as an intruder, but as the woman his son had loved. He confessed that he had hated her because she represented the one thing he couldn't control, Adewale's heart. He admitted that he had been wrong, and that the boy she had raised was a better man than he had ever been. Sarah, moved by the old man's brokenness, told him the truth about why Adewale had never come home. It wasn't just the anger, it was the hope that by staying away, he would eventually force the chief to look for what was missing. "He always loved you," Sarah said, her voice a soft anchor in the vast room. "He just wanted you to love the world as much as he did. Toby is his final gift to you. He has the chance to do it right this time." The chief looked at the photo of his son, the pilot who had flown away from a fortune to find a life, and he felt a profound sense of peace. He realized that the little lord was the culmination of everything good in the Othniel bloodline, filtered through Sarah's grace and the struggle of the Lagos streets. He made a silent vow to Sarah and to the ghost of his son. If Toby survived this night, the Othniel dynasty would never be the same. The forbidden mother was no longer a guest. She was the heart of the house. He took Sarah's hand, a gesture of alliance, and together they went to Toby's room to face the long, cold night of the eve, praying for a miracle that no amount of money could manifest. The returnees, the wealthy Nigerian diaspora, and the urban elite who flocked to the countryside for Christmas began to arrive at the estate in their high-end SUVs and shimmering lace outfits. In previous years, this gala was a performance of excess, a competition of who could spray the most money or with the most expensive jewelry. But as they entered the Othniel mansion this year, they were met with a sight that confused and silenced them. There were no roped-off VIP sections. Instead, the village elders and the estate workers sat at the same tables as the billionaires. The Lion of the Valley didn't stand on a podium. He walked among the people, shaking hands and asking about their families. The atmosphere was charged with a strange, transformative energy, a mixture of the little lord's influence and the somber reality of the boy's illness. The elite, usually so insulated, found themselves forced to look into the eyes of the people their industries impacted. In the presence of the chief's new humility, they found themselves softening as well. Upstairs, Toby lay in his bed, the sounds of the celebration below drifting up like a distant dream. He was too weak to join them, but he had insisted that the doors to his room be left open so he could feel the happy. He looked out the window at the valley, which was lit up with thousands of small lanterns the villagers had placed in the trees as a prayer for his recovery. It looked like the sky had fallen to the earth, a sea of flickering stars against the dark red dust. He felt a profound sense of completion, a knowledge that the bridge he had wanted to build was finally standing. He turned to his mother, who was sitting by his side, and whispered, "The lion is dancing, Mama. Can you hear it?" Sarah nodded, her heart breaking as she saw the effort it took for him to speak. She knew that the heartbreaking Christmas was at its peak, the moment where the beauty of the change met the tragedy of the cost. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in Christmas Day, a sudden silence fell over the house, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd below as the chief stepped onto the balcony and began to speak. The chief's speech was not a proclamation of power, but a confession. He told the gathered crowd the real reason his son, Adewale, had left, not just because of the marriage, but because the chief had planned to build a factory that would have poisoned the valley's water supply. He admitted that Adewale had sacrificed his inheritance to protect the very people who were now celebrating in this room. The heartbreaking discovery for the villagers and the elite alike was the extent of the chief's past ruthlessness, but it was overshadowed by the revelation of Toby's secret. The chief announced that Toby was fighting for his life, and that the boy's only wish was for the estate to become a foundation that would serve the people of the East forever. He pledged his entire fortune to the Toby Othniel legacy, ensuring that no child in the valley would ever go thirsty or uneducated again. The silence that followed was broken not by applause, but by a low, rhythmic chanting from the villagers, a song of healing and gratitude that rose from the gardens and filled the mansion. In that moment, the true mystery of the little lord was revealed. Toby hadn't just come to inherit the estate. He had come to redeem it. He was the sacrifice that the Othniel line required to wash away its sins. As the song reached Toby's room, his eyes fluttered open one last time. He saw the chief and Sarah standing at the foot of his bed, their faces illuminated by the lanterns outside. He saw the journal on the nightstand, its pages filled with the dreams of 2 generations. He smiled, a final, radiant expression of pure love, and said, "It's a beautiful Christmas, grandfather." Then his breath slowed, and the fluttering in his chest grew quiet. The little lord had completed his work. The lion roared one last time, But it wasn't a roar of anger. It was a cry of profound, transformative loss, the sound of a man who had finally learned the value of a single, precious heart. The miracle didn't happen in the way the storybooks usually tell it. Toby didn't suddenly sit up, cured of his ailment. Instead, the miracle was the silence that followed his passing, a silence that wasn't cold or empty, but full of a strange, lingering warmth. As the doctors moved to pronounce the time, something incredible happened. The lion, the man who had never bowed to anyone, knelt by the bed and took Toby's hand. And as he did, he felt a faint, rhythmic pulse return. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The heartbreaking moment of death had been a reset, a moment where the boy's fragile system had seemingly given up, only to be jump-started by the collective will and prayer of 1,000 people. The doctors rushed back into action, their movements frantic but hopeful. The Christmas miracle was the realization that Toby was a fighter, a boy whose soul was too big to leave the world until he saw the sun rise over the valley he had saved. Outside, the harmattan wind suddenly died down, and for the first time in weeks, the air was clear. The red dust settled, revealing a landscape that looked washed and new. The villagers stayed in the gardens, refusing to leave until they heard news. When the chief finally stepped onto the balcony at dawn and gave a simple, tearful thumbs up, the cheer that erupted from the valley was a sound that Enugu would remember for a century. It was a Christmas morning born from the depths of despair, a beautiful tragedy that had turned into a triumph of the human spirit. Toby remained in a deep, healing sleep, his heart now beating with a steady, if slow, rhythm. He had crossed the valley of the shadow and come back, bringing with him a new world. The weeks following Christmas were a time of literal and figurative demolition. The chief ordered the high iron gates of the estate to be taken down and replaced with an open archway that welcomed everyone. The guest lodge was renovated to become a permanent home for Sarah, but she spent most of her time in the main house, where she now sat at the head of the table alongside the chief. The marble halls were no longer silent. They were filled with the noise of construction as parts of the mansion were converted into a public library and a community center. The chief himself changed in ways that shocked the business world. He became a champion of social capitalism, using his influence to force other billionaires to invest in their own communities. He was no longer the lion of the valley in the predatory sense. He was its protector, its elder, and its most humble servant. Toby's recovery was slow but sure. He spent his days in a wheelchair on the terrace, watching as the new school and clinic began to rise in the village below. He was no longer the little lord in a title. He was the heart of the hills. He and Chitty became inseparable, the billionaire's heir and the tenant's son, playing among the construction sites and planning the future. The chief would often sit with them, listening to their ideas with a respect that he had never shown his own business advisors. The walls that had separated the castle from the dust had truly fallen, and in their place, a new community was growing, one built on the foundation of a boy's unfiltered love and a father's forgotten dreams. 1 year later, on Christmas morning, Toby stood on the hill, no longer needing the wheelchair. He was taller, his face glowing with health, the red dust of Enugu now a badge of honor on his skin rather than a threat to his lungs. The valley below him was transformed. The emerald green of the palm trees was vibrant. The new well was a hub of activity, and the school bells were ringing for a morning service. He looked at the locket around his neck, then at the chief, who was standing beside him, looking younger and more at peace than he had in decades. Sarah joined them, her hand resting on Toby's shoulder, her eyes full of the quiet triumph of a woman who had saved her son and redeemed a dynasty. "Do you think he's watching, grandfather?" Toby asked, looking up at the clear blue sky where a single hawk was circling. The chief nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think he's flying right beside us, Toby," he replied. They walked down the hill together, toward the village where a massive Christmas feast was waiting for them. It wasn't a little lord visiting his tenants. It was a family going home. The story of the boy from the yellow bus had become the legend of the golden heir, A cinematic journey that had started in the smog of Lagos and ended in the light of a new African dawn. As they reached the village gates, the children ran to meet them, and the lion laughed, a sound that carried across the valley, a beautiful, final echo of a Christmas that had changed everything. Wait, you actually thought this was a happy ending? A leaked medical report just proved the grandfather knew about the boy's heart condition the whole time and used it as a psychological weapon. This wasn't a Christmas miracle. It was a calculated corporate heist. Hit that share button and comment truth right now to get the link to the secret footage the Othniel family is currently suing to keep offline.